Hello again, it's David and Brent sharing our weekly insights. Today's April the 3rd. March is finally behind us, the longest month in history, it feels like. Again, April the 3rd. So busy week, Brent, around ag and ag markets. Let's start with the big story. The USDA had its prospective planting report. Listeners and readers are going to remember we looked at a lot of data and said 95.5 million acres of corn is going to be sort of a starting point. USDA's number came out around 97 million acres of corn. If that comes through, that would be the second largest corn crop we've planted in modern history. And, the thing we talked about earlier is not because corn's attractive, it's that we have so many corn and soybean acres, and soybeans are much less appealing than they were in the last 6 or so years. So, Brent, I was surprised by the 97 million number. I thought it'd be closer to 95 or 96, but it's definitely to this big end of the spectrum for a corn crop.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I think that is important out of all of that is, the baseline that we've been using of about 180 million acres of corn and soybeans is right on, right? And so the question is, how you divide it up? And I think the analysis we did ahead of that suggested it was going to weigh heavily toward corn, and it did. And I was a little concerned about that going in. I didn't think it would get quite to 97, or it was right at 97, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's some rounding. So 97 was the sort of the summary number, but if you dug in, it was 96.99. It was the table number. So right there.
It was a huge number, and the problem with it, it's not really surprising given the price relationships that were prevalent when that survey took place. So the problem with it is that sets us up for a potentially huge ending stocks on corn, and it's a real problem. We're going to have bad weather, some kind of a supply shock if we plant anywhere close to that much corn. That's not set. It can't happen. It certainly can happen. I think everybody has to remember that there's a long way to go, but the initial indications are going to plant 97 million acres. And if you look in history, that number doesn't fall a lot from those initial prospective planning. So I think you've got to get your head around the idea that the United States is going to seed, if weather cooperates, they're going to put in, 95 million acres of corn somewhere in that neighborhood for sure.
So we started a question back in the fall, and we used 97 million acres of corn as that starting line. I thought it was sort of a high aspiration even up till a week ago, but now that's back in play. And I just want to point out that there is a non-zero probability that the U.S. plants more than 97 million acres of corn. These estimates sort of have built in a lot of factors, and one of those factors it builds in, it's in sort of the black box of all the air they put in is a normal prevent plant. It wasn't that long ago, actually it was a year ago, we wrote a post that says, will prevent plant ever get back to normal? Meaning we had a lot of years of below average prevent plant acres. And so if we come in this year and we have low prevent plant, you could actually see that 180 million acres for corn and soybeans turn north, which would put more pressure on additional corn acres, additional soybean acres. So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying don't be surprised if we see that number walk a little bit higher. It's a non-zero probability given history. Now, it could be a non-zero for you.
Yeah, it's absolutely the case. I mean, there's no reason it can't go higher, and I think it would be not a good situation for corn markets if that were the case, unless you're a buyer. So I just we're setting up for a situation where we have pretty high ending corn stocks. Now the interesting thing is, David, I just every now and then I always like to preach a little bit of caution with people, because think about 2 years ago, we were looking at 1 billion bushel ending stocks on soybeans. At the end, at the end of last year. If we were kind of forecasting out all those numbers, that's the kind of number you came up with. You go, holy cow, this is going to be a disaster. Well, we didn't even get close to that. Why? Well, huge prevent plan. And so it's just say there's a lot of things that can happen between now and the end, and some good, some bad.
Yeah, so to a little different context from what you're saying, we were looking at 22% ending stocks on soybeans last May when that first WASDE report came out. Now some of these early projections of what we're looking at now is back to 10% or less for the crop that we're planting now. So we went from sort of record high stocks a calendar year ago to now we're looking at the crop ahead of us, and it's going to be closer to that range where we start to feel a little bit tight. I was surprised corn markets didn't go limit down with 97 million acres of corn. But the markets have a lot going on. But the one thing that's worth pointing out on the markets is that we had another question close, and that was the probability of the December 2020 corn futures contract falling below $3.50. That happened this week as futures markets, this actually happened on the second after that report, corn prices turned lower.
Yeah, it's been a pretty rough downhill ride for corn prices and bean prices for that matter. So a lot of projected revenue falling off the income statement on farms right now.
So just a bit of context, back at the beginning of the year, January 1st, the consensus thought there's about a 33% chance of us falling below that 350 corn. That climbed obviously pretty quickly throughout the last few months as commodity prices turned lower. We also fell through that lower price level for soybeans. We had that at $9 a bushel. That fell lower. That fell below the threshold earlier this month. So a bad month for the low end of commodity markets as we've hit both of those. So make sure you check your scores. You can go to that scores tab and check all that out. Brent and I were comparing earlier. The other question that resolved actually hit last week, is the probability of 100,000 cases of COVID-19 in the U.S. And we hit that threshold last week actually as well. So on the 27th. So 6 questions resolved. Check out your scores for those 6. It's always interesting to see how your expectations, 1, changed over time, and 2, how your score stacked up. And I don't do this as well as I should, but you should leave notes. That way, when you go back and review your score, you can see what happened. Quick story on the soybean acreage. I actually changed my forecast right at the last minute, right before the report came out, and I upped the probability of exceeding 84 million acres, and that didn't happen. So I need to go back and review why I changed my forecast at the last minute and went the wrong direction there.
It was close though, right?
It was close, 83.5. So yeah, it was right there on the over/under for that. Also want to point out there's a really great interview posted on the overview tab. A couple folks interviewed about ethanol and the COVID-19 situation. Intuitively, I think we all knew that the oil price market shock was going to be painful for ethanol producers. This story did a great job of underlining why, talking about the RINs, those renewable energy numbers, what's going on there, that small refinery exemption that's been going on, and then, of course, the drop in gasoline demand. So it's going to be a tough situation for the ethanol markets. Great story. I learned a lot from this. Again, I knew the 30,000-foot implications, but digging in the details and reading those transcripts were really insightful.
Yeah, I think, I really encourage you to take a look at that interview because, we're trying to put stuff in there that we think is important and relevant. And that's a really just a huge issue right now as to what is going to happen to the ethanol industry. And so, we want to get good information, make rational decisions about what we're doing. But the ethanol situation is not good right now.
And of course, that carries over into usage and a lot of implications as that moves through. I think, one of the things that the article pointed out is just so much uncertainty coming out of the administration as to the direction of ethanol. And so that's just really setting the stage. It was a great story, especially when you read the transcript. It sort of talked about, beyond 2020 and 2021, there's some things that you got to keep your eye on for ethanol. And between the small refinery exemptions and then this and where the future's at, there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets, and uncertainty often doesn't lead to a lot of investments into a space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, I really encourage you to dig into that information. I think it's good stuff.
The other story I want to mention, it's in the reference material there on the bottom right, is a timeline. We put together a timeline of all the things that have happened over the last 3 months, but really the last month. It's been interesting and fast as to how quick all the information has changed around COVID-19. We just passed a $2 trillion spending bill last week. The federal government spent $4.5 trillion, roughly speaking, last year. So a big stimulus to the economy. We're still trying to figure out how that's going to play out. Maybe some additional aid for producers, but not clear at this point. So it's amazing how fast everything shifted and turned. It seems like we walked into a completely different world just a few weeks ago.
It's absolutely crazy. And, today is the first day you can apply for your PPP loan, Paycheck Protection Program. Be interesting to see how fast they blow through $395 billion. How fast can you spend $395 billion? It's going to go fast. And it's just weird world we're living in.
And to add to that, another stimulus might be on the horizon. They're talking about another $1 trillion sort of round 4, phase 4 response. And the implications, as we've talked about before, are going to be around here for a long, long time. One of the things I also want to point out, Brent, you and I were talking earlier, the data are starting to improve on the COVID cases. Doesn't seem like it. We were chatting earlier, 30,000 new cases last night. Seems like a giant number, but I've updated the data posts that we've been looking at, and we're starting to see a gap between what those initial projections that we plugged in said we'd be in the future and where we actually are right now. So to give you a quick idea, 245,000 cases yesterday. If we would have stayed on the growth rate that we were on, even 10 days ago, we would be at 700,000 cases today or yesterday. This weekend, we would have hit 1 million cases. And so the curve, so to speak, is starting to flatten. We looked at the growth rates on a daily basis. We were at a 30% growth rate. So daily, every day, we were adding 30%. Just 2 weeks ago, now it's down around 15%. So we're making some improvements.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing to watch the growth rate. And as that starts to decline, it's really going to slow. The numbers are still going to be big, but that growth rate, if we can get that down a lot closer to zero, is going to make a huge difference. Keep in mind, we're doubling right now at a 10% growth rate, doubling every 7 days. So we would be at, 800,000 cases, 900,000 cases in a couple weeks. So be interesting to see how that plays out, but watch that growth rate. That's what's important in my mind.
Yeah. Not trying to say that, it's not a serious situation. It's still a very serious situation. We still had 30,000 additional cases. The point we're trying to make is that we could have expected a much different outcome today if we didn't see that slowdown. So this is perhaps there's been some good news in the last week or so, right? The stock market has made some improvements. It's not continued its cratering. We saw the stimulus bill getting passed. There's some relief coming to businesses, and now the growth rate has started to slow down, especially over the last 7 to 10 days. So starting to see some positive developments.
Yeah, and keep in mind, the growth rate is slowing down with a lot of increased testing as well. So just keep, I think there's some good signs.
Yeah, I don't think you can underscore. I was looking at some Indiana data, and it was amazing how many tests, especially last week. They did more tests in one day last week than they had done in the entire, 20 or so days previously. And so testing has increased at a very rapid rate. So yeah, a bigger sample of people being tested, and actually the numbers are starting to slow down. The growth rate is starting to slow down. Brent, what else do you have on your mind? What are you watching the next
Uh,
week or so?
not much else. I mean, we've covered most of it. I'm very concerned about the corn situation. I mean, personally, and so I'm really trying to understand and think rationally through what that means for everybody. And then, like you said, the watching the growth rate, but also watching kind of the economy, and for not the obvious things, but like the secondary tremors that are going to work their ways through the economy as things go bad, including, the oil situation. There was some really good news, or well, depends how you think about it, but for oil prices jumped up when Trump said that he'd been talking to the Russians and the Saudis about taking a big cut. Whether that actually happens or not, nobody, I think, knows. So there's a lot of moving pieces out there, but the economic damage, I'm still not sure we have a good handle on exactly how bad that's going to be.
Uh, yeah, and I think the economic damage sort of there's two parts to this, right? There's the slowdown and then the recovery. And we're just going through the slowdown now, so we don't know what kind of recovery we might have. And so do we recover back to, maybe an unemployment level that was in line with where we were a month ago? Do we get there in 2 or 3 months, or do we get there in 2 or 3 years? I think that's the other question. So we got to keep that in mind as well. All right. Well, that's all we have for this week, unless Brent's got a.
Nope.
All right. That's all for this week. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you all next week. Thanks so much.